The Simone Feiler podcast, giving authors a platform. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, I have been on the most incredible journey for the last 2 weeks, crossing the interior of Australia by four-wheel drive, a solar-powered car, camel, boat, canoe, and on foot with the most inspirational desert walker, Denis Bartell. Denis has not only been the first to follow some of Australia's pioneer European explorers of our outback, but he's also set some firsts of his own with record-breaking trips across our amazing country, the first being in 1977, the first cross-country crossing of the Simpson Desert through its centre from Cape Byron in New South Wales to Steep Point in Western Australia, and back again. Thank you so much for joining me for my podcast, Denis.
Good morning, Simone.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
I'd also like to welcome Janae, Denis's beautiful wife, who's been here as support throughout the audiobook recording.
Hi, Simone.
Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
So, Denis has just wound up a massive 30 hours narrating his life story, journeying through the outback. And this is one audiobook that I highly recommend if you love an adventure, if you want to learn about Australian explorers, or if you just want to be inspired to get out and do amazing things in your life. So, Denis, the first question I've got for you is, how does the enclosure of the booth compare to the vastness of the desert?
Simone, it was fairly claustrophobic in there, I must admit. No, it's a very confined space, that's for sure.
Even though it was pretty close in there, did you enjoy narrating your book?
Simone, I did actually. When I started this journey, I had two options. One, to reproduce my book in hardcover, but I'd heard about audiobooks and I thought I'd pursue that channel, which I did. And I decided that in the end that I didn't want to produce another hardcover. It's fairly costly. And this audiobook seems to be more the trend, actually, I think. So then I had the two major decisions. How did I do it? Did I get someone to narrate my story, or did I narrate it myself? And it was rather fortunate that I made contact with you purely by accident, and you talked me into doing all of this. So yes, it's 30 hours of fairly concentrated effort.
Yeah.
But I think we've put something reasonable together.
I think you did an outstanding job. I really do. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about yourself and the book. Obviously, you found a love with the outback in Australia, and particularly the early European explorers. Why did you find early explorers so intriguing and fascinating?
Well, I was introduced to them probably as a kid when Hume and Hovell crossed the Murrumbidgee at a place where I was actually living at the time, Hume Park. And that was, I guess, my first association with them. And I've just been inspired by their adventures, the challenges that they had to face in the outback. You've got to remember that when white men arrived in Australia, it was a big blob of nothing to them. The Aboriginals knew all about it, but the white man didn't. He had no idea. He had no idea what was out in the middle. He didn't have any maps, nothing. And so I've been inspired by them, by the challenges they faced, the hardships that they endured to conquer this land.
I know you have. So how did the decision of actually going across the desert first strike you? What triggered that?
Well, I'd had a lot of experience in the desert. I'd worked out there for quite some time in the outback, mining exploration actually. And a chap called Hans Solstrop whizzed across Australia in a little Daihatsu vehicle. And he said it was pretty horrific, the trip, and he didn't think it could be done in any less time than he did it in, which was 13 days.
Right.
So, you see, I liked a bit of a challenge. So I set about, I got a little Suzuki and I set about beating his time, and I got it down to 10 days. So that's how I first started the, I guess, my adventuring days, if you like.
Your love affair with the desert, the inland of Australia.
Yeah, well, as I said, I'd been working in it for many, many years prior to that. But I've always thought of myself probably as a 50-50 person. 50% of me was bush, 50% of me was city. And I had these just two distinct personalities, if you like. One was city, one was bush. So I always loved getting back, and the thrill of a challenge, going back to beat his record, that was just too much to resist.
Yeah.
So, yes, I did it, and that was good. And I continued on from then. From that, I suppose, that started the publicity. All my adventures prior to that had just been for personal reasons and no great contact with media or news or anything, video or anything. But that one started it off, because the press did then hone in on the trip and gave me quite a lot of publicity throughout Australia on my journey. So that after that, well, I think the press, the last question they asked was, and I found out later that they always ask this, well, what's next? So I came up with what's next, and I did a lot of what's
on
next
the spot.
on the spot. So yes, it developed into not only vehicle crossings of Australia, but walks and solo cars and camels and canoes and all sorts of things.
Yeah, very cool. Back to your book, there's many incidents in Desert Walker that I personally found incredibly spiritual. And one that comes to mind straight up is of explorer David Lindsay and his chisel, which may or may not have even been a chisel. And he could have lost it, or the Aborigines could have nicked it. This phrase kept running through your head repeatedly. Can you tell our listeners in a very sort of shortened form, as a teaser to your book, what this story's about and how that happened?
Well, one of my favourite explorers, particularly of the Simpson Desert, is David Lindsay. And in 1886, he penetrated into the Simpson Desert, the first white man to do so. And he used for his survival quite a series of native wells, or mickeries, one of which at Walporigan he blazed a tree with his initials DL and nailed up a tin plate. And in about 1979, I relocated that particular site. It had been lost for 40 odd years. No one knew where it was.
Wow.
And I relocated it. Not even the Aborigines knew where it existed. And I found the tree with his initials.
That would be like finding a needle in a haystack already.
Well, it was really. Yes, I had 9 to find that he'd used, and I found a lot. But this was, in particular, the most impressive one for me, because how it started off, I was standing next to the tree, and I suddenly thought, I think this was anticipation. Why didn't he blaze any more? Because I loved the challenge, the thrill of the chase and finding more trees. And I suppose that brought on the next thought was, well, why didn't he blaze any more trees? I wonder if he lost his chisel or the Aboriginals nicked it. That's how it started off. And it then became like a monotonous chant in my brain. Even back home in Adelaide, I'd be sitting there and I'd suddenly think, I wonder what happened to his chisel. I wonder if the Aboriginals nicked it or he lost it. So some years later, I was back in the desert and I was taking a scientific group out to assess these well sites. And I arrived back at the tree and I showed them the tree and the blaze mark, and then sent them off to go and do some exploration for bones and artefacts and things scattered amongst the sand dunes. And while I was standing there, the same monotonous chant came back again. Did he lose his chisel or did the Aboriginals nick it? And it was very, very forceful. I don't know how to explain it other than that. So anyhow, while they were away for something to do, I got out my metal detector and I thought I'll just scout around a bit and see if there's anything metallic lying there. And I just headed off, my head down, no perceived direction as to where I was going. And I looked up, and just off to my left there was a series of sticks poking out of the ground. Well, that was the framework of an old wheelchair or humpy Aboriginal home, in other words. So I just turned direction and I walked over towards that. And when I got to the front of it, the entrance, the metal detector went off with a loud bang. So I scraped the sand away with my foot and up came charcoal, which can give a sound. But I put the head over it again and there was this enormous noise. So I ran my boot over the ashes and out rolled, you can guess it, a chisel.
That's crazy.
Now, how on earth did I, on all those occasions, think what happened to his chisel? And now I've found a chisel in a humpy. Now, I can tell you this, it was sitting on the top of the ashes. Part of the handle, which was wood, hadn't burnt away. So I do know one thing of that chisel. The last person to hold that chisel was an Aboriginal. And I would say it was the day they departed the desert forever. He threw his chisel into the fire. That was why it was on the top and it hadn't burnt completely. Now, I don't say that it was David Lindsay's chisel. I make no claims like that because I don't even know whether he owned a chisel, to be quite honest. But the very fact that that chant kept hammering in my brain like some sort of just continual, I can't explain it.
Like someone
and it was
was
someone was saying, "Well, that's right. Go and find the chisel."
Yeah.
So yes, that chisel is fairly special to me. But I know who held it last. It was an Aboriginal sitting in front of his little timber structure, his humpy, and I would say it's the last day before they left to walk out of the desert.
And so you've got that chisel though?
Yes, I've got it at home with me. It's one of my prized possessions.
Yeah, so amazing.
If I go back there, I take it with me. And
yeah, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But that also leads me to another bone chiller in your story with you finding Scotty out in the desert. That's another thing you were thinking about your friend Scott or Scotty, and then you came across him somewhere in the middle of the desert.
Oh yeah, these weird things sort of keep happening, strangely enough.
I just think it's so bizarre because it's like kilometres, thousands of kilometres big.
Well, I'll tell you a couple. One, I was married to Jenny then, and we were living in Noosa. And I woke up one morning and I said to her, "Darling, there's someone sitting on the edge of the bed. The bed's sinking. Someone's sitting on it." And she said, "There's no one there." I said, definitely someone was sitting on the edge of the bed. Anyhow, a number of years later, I was out fossicking with a friend from the Noosa area, and we were out in a field looking for gold. And as you normally do, you light the fire and you sit around the fire chatting about nothing things. And up came ghosts and spirits and all that sort of stuff. He said to me, "Denis, have you ever heard of the ghost of Noosa?" And I said, "No, what's that?" And he said, "Well, it's well known with the locals there that this ghost spirit, he'll come and he'll sit on the bed.
What the heck?
While you're asleep." And I thought, God, and this had happened to me. I couldn't believe it. But you asked me about meeting Scotty, the roo shooter, on the Nullarbor. Well, it was actually after my mate Len died on me in the creek bed, and I was travelling home, and I wasn't feeling that well at all. As a matter of fact, I knew there was something horribly wrong with me. And I had left Norseman in Western Australia, heading home to Adelaide. And I was driving along and I was thinking of Scotty and the kangaroo shooter from Eucla and the times we'd been out together shooting kangaroos and all the things that went with it and having a few drinks at the bar. And this continual thought was going through my mind. I wonder where Scotty is now. I wonder where Scotty is now. Just like the chisel, it was the same sort of thing. I wonder where Scotty is now. This went on for about an hour or more, I suppose. And I looked ahead and I was watching a vehicle coming towards me. And as it drew right up alongside, I thought, bloody hell, that's Scotty, the roo shooter.
What the
I
heck?
couldn't believe it. So, of course, I wheeled my car around and roared after him and caught up with him. And we had a good old chat, reminiscing. So there you are. I just don't know.
Maybe it's when you're out in the desert. Well, I mean, you've just given the Noosa story, but when you're out in the desert, you probably become in tune with the land or whatever,
Well, you do. It's actually, on some of my trips, they've been for quite a period of time. And especially my walk across Australia from north to south came down through the Simpson. And I spent weeks in the desert by myself, just locked into the dual corridors. And you actually do become at one with the desert, with all the things that live in it. You become at one with it. And yes, anyone intrudes on that, which happened occasional times when the press flew in, it is really an intrusion. It breaks the whole cycle. And it takes probably a day until you can get back into your desert rhythm, if you like.
Well, you're an incredibly gifted writer. There's such a vivid description in your of your malnourishment in the story when you describe how your body is consuming itself. More chills. That was amazing hearing that. I could basically see that in my mind's eye. But how did you cope mentally to survive your many crossings with next to no food, no water, no contact to the outside world, just June after June after June?
I think it's called winning.
Yeah,
incredible. And you set yourself a goal, you set the challenge, and you just go out and you do it. And yes, my first walk across the Simpson Desert was from west to east, And that was probably the most difficult journey that I've ever undertaken in my life, because I did run short of water and food.
That was the unaided one that you decided?
That was unaided,
Yeah.
yes. I managed to cross the Simpson Desert from west to east, solo unaided.
With a backpack, and that's it?
Well,
On
with a
foot?
cart, I pulled a cart for part of the way up and down the sandhills to about the halfway mark. And then I drilled for water on one of the Aboriginal wells that I'd found. And at 12 feet, I got enough water for me to carry on. I abandoned the cart and then backpacked the rest of the way into Birdsville. But it was that last section that my food had been rather inadequate, so I wasn't giving my body the nourishment it needed. My water levels were way, way down to what they should be for the exertion that I was putting into it. And so I was gradually, yes, deteriorating, and slowly my urine went black and my bowels were just little brown berries, or black berries, and I knew that
Stomach lining, probably. Of stomach lining, probably.
Yeah, I knew that yes, things were not good. And then in the last few days before I got to Birdsville, I had this incredible trembling in my stomach and my body. It was like I was shivering.
Wow.
And yet I wasn't cold, I was just shivering. So I would think, I'm only guessing, but I think that my body was starting to then say, you've had enough here, buddy. This is not good.
Shutting down.
So yes, by the time I got into Birdsville, I'd really put myself through hell, actually.
Yeah.
And my last night in the desert, I can remember walking along in the moonlight, and there was a dingo ghosting along beside me.
Oh,
and
that's such a good story.
and I'd stop, and he'd stop, and then he left me after a while. But I can vividly remember that.
That's a very eerie a bit of your book as well. But like that didn't stop you from going out there and doing that again.
Well, once I
several times. Like we're not talking. This man has not just walked across the desert once or twice, up and down and across, like or driven or gone along in boats and canoes. It's been well over 50, 70 times. I just learnt today at the end of your book.
Well, when I finished that west to east solo crossing unaided of the Simpson Desert, I recuperated slowly, I must admit.
Yeah.
And the following year, I thought to myself, I'd love to cross the desert north to south, solo unaided. And that's how it started off, and it developed into, actually, well, why not walk across Australia at the same time? Which I then did, walking across from the Gulf of Carpentaria to the Gulf of St Vincent.
And is that where you raised money on one of your walks for the Flying Doctors?
That walk was for the Royal Flying Doctor Association.
Yeah.
And we raised, I didn't raise a thing because I hardly saw anyone, but we raised about $70,000, which in those days was an enormous sum of money, actually. But more than that, it set the publicity that walk developed or attracted, encouraged a lot of other people at that time to start doing similar sorts of things to raise money for the Royal Flying Doctor. So it wasn't just the 70,000, it was what it started, and they commented on that.
You're a trailblazer. So awesome to be working with you. Like there's other incredible moments scattered throughout the already incredible story, Desert Walker. Like this one time when you were in the middle of the desert and the Qantas plane flew over your whereabouts somewhere in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and you're having a chat with them via the two-way or the phone.
Yeah, well, that was a bit of a hoot, actually. It had been arranged that I would try to contact the Qantas QF1 from Sydney to Singapore, I think. And I knew it flew over the middle of the Simpson Desert. So I had my HF radio with me. So one day I just plopped on the ground, put up my aerial and got the set out. And I was watching the contrails going across the sky of the jets. And I knew that this one should be going over at this particular time. So I started my transmission with Qantas QF1. This is 50 Bravo X-ray, do you copy? And I waited a little bit, and the next thing came back, 50 Bravo X-ray, this is QF1, how do you read? So we had a chat for a while, and the skipper said, look, I'll patch you through to the cabin area, then you can talk, while we're talking there, they can listen. And I had to laugh because I was sitting on the southern edge of the Simpson Desert, and I said to them, now if the passengers on the left-hand side would like to look out of the window, they'll see some salt lakes. And down there I'll be sitting. That's where I am, talking to you." And the captain came back rather hurriedly and said, Dennis, you misunderstood me. We were rerouted today. We're flying up near the Gulf of Carpentaria." And I went back and I said, "Oh, that's all right. Now, with the passengers on the right-hand side look down and they'll see the Gulf of Carpentaria." Now, that's where I started my walk, 900 kilometres away. So, yes, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. I'd never do that again, I guess.
Yeah, that's very cool. As if, even just you thinking that you might be able to connect to the plane overflying. What?
No, it was good. And I loved the chat with them. And just the fact he patched me through to the cabin so that everyone on the plane could hear, actually.
Very awesome.
But we discussed the fact that Qantas or their early days, started in Longreach, and the Royal Flying Doctor Service supplied the first aircraft.
Qantas supplied it to... Yeah.
So, yes, so I had a good chat, and that was a lot of fun. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah. That was one of the highlights in the book. But not only crossing the desert, some of the desert stories you talk about with the animals, including the camel and the ewe that you go back to. I won't talk about them now, but when you were narrating it, I'm left thinking about it, thinking I should be really concentrating on what you're reading now, but I can't stop thinking about what you've just, what the... And along with that, when you did your boating trip, and in particular your canoe trip, you slept with millions of spiders. Oh my goodness. And the midges, you said there were swarms of midges that you couldn't believe. Yeah. And you were calling these small things out there. What the heck? I can't get over all those spiders.
No, I do remember the spiders, that's for sure. I'd been on this particular journey, it was down the Cooper Creek, and I was trapped in a swamp overnight on my canoe. Actually, I spent 2 nights on my canoe, trapped in the swamp, trying to find a way out. And during that afternoon, I had to break through a lot of trees to try and find a path through, because the water, being in flood now, was up in the treetops, so it was very difficult, and I couldn't see very far. And I pursued down in the direction of the flow, but I had to break my way through, break branches off to get the canoe through. And of course, all the spiders that were in the trees, they were just shaken down into me, or over me and into the boat. So I had them crawling everywhere, actually. And yes, it was. I just let the little blighters stay there because there was nothing I could do about it. So I just put up with them. They crawled over my face at night, which wasn't very pleasant.
Oh my goodness, that's everyone's worst nightmare.
But the biggest worry actually was not them. It was snakes, because during the flood, their holes are inundated, so they're forced to swim to higher ground or find ground again. And you get a 5 or 6 foot king brown snake swimming, coming across your canoe at night, and he wants a place to rest. He'd just crawl up over the side and get into bed with you.
Oh my God.
So that was the frightening part, not the spiders.
Yeah. One bite from him, you're gone. But not you. Not through all you've been through. It's amazing. And you've also, years after you've done your own trekking, you teamed up with both your son and your daughter have crossed the desert with you. We've just learnt today of the desert mum. So your daughter rang you up one day and said, "Hey, Dad."
Well, she did.
You know that crappy present you bought me for Christmas? It's payback.
Well, she did. She continually reminds me of the fact that I gave my son a car and she got a pink hairdryer. So, she wanted to walk. She came up with this idea that she wanted to follow in Dad's footsteps and walk the desert. And then she decided that she'd ask 2 of her girlfriends, would they like to go? And that developed into 3 others. So suddenly I was being asked to take 4 ladies across the desert to do a walk. And they were raising money for breast cancer research. Yeah. That's what it developed into. And they were trying to raise about $105,000, I think, to give someone a scholarship. Yes, that was a wonderful time in my life, because I got to be backup for my daughter and her friends. And they had an incredible journey, and I'm very proud of them. And they raised, actually, in the end, they raised something like about $170,000 or $180,000. Wow. So it was a darn fine effort on their part.
Yeah, absolutely. She would have seen you, all of her friends as well, in a completely different way. I mean, they did it once, obviously, and it was grueling because during the story you said they lost a lot of weight during it, and obviously it was incredibly hard. They all crumbled out of the desert at the end of the day. But all of them must have had a newfound respect for you that, that you happened to do it so many times.
Well, yes, I suppose by comparison they could not have avoided that.
Yeah.
But no, look, they did a damn fine job. And I'm
raising all that money is
I'm very, very proud of all of them, and extremely proud of my daughter. Two of them I didn't think were going to get there, actually. One was in a lot of pain with her back, and the other one, her feet weren't travelling very well.
But they did it, didn't they?
But they did it. They walked into Birdsville, knocked on the door when they got there. I remembered standing at the hotel watching them arrive. And they were coming from away in the distance, and they were walking into Birdsville. And I have to admit, transported back 20 years prior to that, when as a solitary figure I'd walked in with my backpack on. But I walked in with my daughter this time because in her pocket she carried a photo of me that was taken by the press of my actually walking into Birdsville.
Oh, wow.
So in fact, I walked into Birdsville with my daughter. So yes, it was wonderful that occurred, and I suppose one of the magnificent experiences was having a dance with her on the sands one morning, the last morning before getting to Birdsville. And they played a beautiful Andre Bocelli and Sarah Brightman, Time to Say Goodbye. And my daughter and I danced on the sand under the stars before the sun came up, and that experience I'll never forget.
Yeah,
wonderful.
It was beautiful to hear that as well. I shed a tear or two. The book is outstanding. There's so many adventures in there. It's really hard to put down.
Well, I didn't stop with just one. I liked all sorts of adventures: the walking, the driving, the solar-powered car.
Yeah.
I love flying. I love boating.
There's so much I can ask you. I could sit here all day. I really could, and just. It's really hard for me recording audiobooks with the author narrating it, obviously, because you've got a job to do and I've got a job to do. But seriously, I'm sitting here thinking if I could just want to ask you so many questions along the way. So I try and make myself notes. But definitely, yeah, it's been an absolute journey. That's all I can say.
Well, I wished that I could have done a few more of different varieties. I wanted to do a horse journey of some magnitude.
Right.
That was very much on my mind. So much so that while I was in Noosa, I went to someone who had horses and did shoeing and that sort of thing. And I rode horses when I was younger, down on the farm, bareback actually, no saddle. But I hadn't had much more experience than that in the intervening years. But yes, I did want to do something of magnitude with horses.
Yeah.
I would have loved that.
Yeah. So the first time you went out there, apart from work, when you first crossed it in the Suzuki, what you said you were 42, or how old were you?
I think I was about roughly 44, 45, somewhere in that vicinity.
So over the period, because the last time you went out, I was also gobsmacked, was you were 76 when you went out there to say goodbye to the like, who goes to the desert at 76? Oh, that's right. Dennis.
Well, actually, I've been out there since. It's not in the book.
Right.
But,
and I've got to congratulate you, Dennis. Dennis has just celebrated his 89th birthday on Sunday just gone, April 3, and he's just spent 30 hours recording his own work, his own audiobook. So inspirational. So inspirational. So do tell.
Well, I have been back twice, Simone.
Yeah, tell me.
And I did thoroughly enjoy it. Someone decided they had an empty seat in the front of their vehicle.
Right.
Would I like to go for a trip back into the desert? And they were going to go at places that I'd been to before many times. Yeah. And I said yes, and I had a thoroughly enjoyable trip. Okay. It was actually reenacting one of my first crossings of the Simpson Desert.
Is that right?
Well, a bloke called Cecil Madigan across the northern Simpson Desert in 1939. And I was asked, could I reenact that journey for the Overlander Magazine? And I said, yes, I'll give that a go, which I did. So I was the first vehicle to cross what we now call the Madigan Line. 40 years after that, I was asked to go again, after I first did that crossing. So Madigan did it 40 years after I reenacted his crossing.
Yeah.
Another 40 years on, and I was reenacting my own crossing.
Wow.
I was taken out to reenact that, which was fabulous.
Wow, so that wasn't long ago.
And then
5 years ago.
was it last year? I think it was last
5
year.
years ago, what a champion.
Last year, they dragged this old body out from retirement and decided to shake it out in the desert one more time. So I was invited out to go with a magnificent group. It consisted of all blokes. And I had a front seat, and I was taken on a marvellous trip, reenacting. Of course, I showed them things.
Yeah.
Obviously, that was part of the point of the episode.
Yeah, definitely.
But I thoroughly enjoyed it, and so I'm 89 now, and I'm not sure if they asked me would I like to go again.
Would you?
Yes.
I could tell. I knew he was going to say that. You can't keep a the desert dweller away from the desert.
This last one, they treated me like I was a king and made my tent up for me every day in my bed. And then one night, it had rained very early on, so we headed for the tents quickly. And then it eased a bit, and I was in bed, and the chap that was taking me over, looking after me, he suddenly arrives at the door with a cup of coffee and a biscuit. And I said to him, if ever you tell anyone that the old desert walker had tea and bicky in bed, I'll kill you.
Yeah, that's hilarious, considering you said, I remember in Desert Mums, your daughter saying to her friends, there's no way you're going to get breakfast in bed for Mother's Day. Neck minute, tea and bickies for the desert walker. Oh, well, deservedly so. I think by what you've put into your life and the desert and being a part of the desert, you deserve to have tea.
Well, look, it gave me a thrill, not only just for myself, but to share my knowledge with them, because most of them, it was the first time. The one that took me, no, it wasn't.
Right.
He was driven across it quite a few times. But to the other, it was all brand new. So I could tell them tales of early explorers and things that I'd done out there.
Well, that's another thing I wanted to say about your book. I think I mentioned it in the beginning of our podcast, that it's a history lesson. Like, it really is. You describe not only your trek of it, but from the early European explorers that went out there first, the Burke and Wills and Human Hovel. I probably remember them better from your book than I do from school then.
Sturt and Stewart. Actually, why I do that is because they endured hardships that people now wouldn't know about. Incredible hardships.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have any idea of the hardships.
Well, I think I've had a slight insight with your book, and anyone that hears your book will be able to have that slight insight.
If I can bring up their names, and there's people like, the ones we remember are Burke and Wills. Pretty well everyone knows that Burke and Wills tried to cross the continent. They did, they came back, and then they died before they got home. But they did manage to get across. Yeah. Now, while they were doing that, there was a character in Adelaide called Stewart, and he hopped on his horse with a companion and a couple of other horses, and they rode nearly all the way across, but were beaten back by the Aboriginals who attacked them, and they were short of food. So he came back to Adelaide, and then he reprovisioned and set off again, this time with more horses and a few more people. And the government decided to give him $1 or $2 to help him.
Yeah.
And he rode all the way back again and penetrated a little bit further until the thorn bushes beat him and his horses. So he returned again to Adelaide, all the way back again.
Wow.
Well, he was a terror because he gathered more people together, more horses, and he headed back again. Meanwhile, Burke and Wills are just going.
You sound
up
a lot
back.
like him.
So he was on his third trip now, trying to get across Australia. Nearly made it twice, and on the third one he did make it.
Oh.
But he suffered badly, and coming near to home, they had to put him on a stretcher, and they slung him between two horses on a stretcher and carried him home. And he was nearly blind. So yes, it took a lot out of those people, a lot out of them.
Yeah. And you've also said in your book, I think even when you went back with your daughter, how it's changed. Like, it's not the way it was. I mean, obviously you need a permit to do anything nowadays, and you're lucky if you can get that permit. But, how would you describe the change of the outback?
Well, it has. But to give you an example, when I first went bush, so that's just under 70 years ago, I went out past Ayers Rock. Now, Ayers Rock, there was nothing there. If anyone knows Ayers Rock now, there's a huge resort. There was nothing there. There was no chain up the rock to climb. There was nothing. And yes, and Dalhousie Springs, I could pull in there any time of the day or night, and there'd be no one there. Now, of course, there's all the tourists everywhere. So four-wheel driving and tourists, the movement of tourists, have changed it all completely. So once where I could roam, say, freely without restriction of any sort, now you're quite right. There are fences and there are signs that say keep out or you'll be shot or something similar. And huge tracts of land that are forbidden to the normal traveller. Wow. But look, having said that, that's only my vision of the past because I lived through that. And I do miss it, obviously. But anyone now going bush, don't be put off, because what you'll find is something magical anyhow.
Of course.
It won't have what I had, but I can guarantee you it's still going to be magical and you'll thoroughly enjoy it.
Oh, you're awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me on my podcast today. Where can people find out more now? You have got a DVD that I've watched with you guys the other night. That's amazing. Like, I cried through that as well as the book, but just gives you a real insight as to, it's got footage of you actually out there in the desert doing it. So what's your website, Denis?
The website is www.desertwalker.com.au.
All right, and to the Desert Walker, thank you so much for letting me be part of your journey with this.
It's my pleasure, Simone.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining the Simone Feiler podcast.
What's your story?
Contact Simone for a chat at brisbaneaudiobookproduction.com.